Okay, I want to talk a little bit about shutter speeds. The shutter in a DSLR, the shutter is a little window in front of the sensor which opens for a precisely measured amount of time to let light in, which is what makes the exposure on your sensor. Many phone cameras have a rolling shutter which turns on light sensitivity of rows of pixels for a precise interval. Some of them actually turn the whole sensor on for a precise interval. Either way, the important number is the shutter speed. So the shutter speeds are measured in fractions of a second. And if you look at a little diagram on the right there, basically shutter speed in a third of a stop is actually most common on cameras now, newer DSLRs, and also in phone cameras with Lightroom. Remember, check the Lightroom app. It lets you control your shutter speed. The higher the number, they're fractions of a second. So the higher the number, the less time the shutter stays open, the faster the shutter opens and closes. So it lets less light in. It also affects motion, which we'll talk about in a minute. And you can see the lower the number, the more light it's getting in. The higher the number, the less light it's letting in. It also controls the depiction of motion. So you think of it this way: how long does the shutter stay open? How far is the subject going to move in that time? If you leave your shutter open for, say, half a second and someone's walking past, they're going to walk quite far in that half second. And what will happen is, because they're moving, their image on the sensor will be blurred and the picture will be blurred. If your shutter is open for 1,000th of a second and they're walking by, they're not going to walk that far. So their image on the sensor is not moving and their image will be sharp. The other thing to keep in mind is camera motion. And it's really impossible for you to hold your camera perfectly still unless you have it on a tripod. So shutter speed is something to keep in mind when you're hand holding the camera. So we'll look at some examples of both of these. This is camera motion. So you can see at the bottom left, at 1/8 of a second, you can see the image actually doesn't look that bad, but when I've magnified the clock on the wall there, you can see it's quite blurred. At 1/25th of a second, the shutter is open for about a third of but as long as it was in the 1/8 of a second one, and it's actually fairly sharp. At a 1/60th of a second, you can see the clock is pretty sharp. So that's camera motion. Subject motion, camera motion, sorry. Camera motion is also affected by the focal length of the lens. So if you're using a really long telephoto lens, which would be more on a DSLR than a phone camera, the longer the telephoto lens, the more motion blur you're likely to get. Okay, subject motion. As I mentioned, your subject's moving. You got to look at how far the subject is moving while the shutter is open. So if you look at these, bottom left, at a 1/15th of a second, this woman is riding a bicycle through the studio. You can see she's quite blurred at 1/15th of a second. And you can see as we go from a 15th to a 60th to 1/25th to 1/500th, the image gets sharper. Again, because she doesn't move that far while the shutter is open. So the image is sharper. Direction of the motion affects the amount of motion blur. So you can have the same shutter speed, but different amounts of blur. Movement across your field of vision will show more motion blur than the subject moving towards away from you, as you can see from these images. The closer you are to the subject, the moving subject, the faster the shutter speed required. This picture is actually taken from a car window, and you can see the close area along the ditch there is really quite blurred, whereas if you look at the distance, it's actually quite sharp. So closer looks like it's moving further, so it'll be more blurred. The faster your subject is moving, the higher the shutter speed you're going to need. So you can see on the left, They've used a very high shutter speed to freeze the water droplets, and on the right, the skateboarder. If you want to show a blurred subject, which is actually a aesthetic decision here, camera on tripod on the left, and the slow shutter speed, which is, in my guess is probably around a quarter of a second, depending on how fast the bus is moving. You can see that the bus is blurred, everything else is sharp. The one on the right, you can see the dog was just moving enough so that parts of it are blurred, gives you an impression of motion. Pan shot is a very specific kind of slow shutter speed shot. Basically, what you're trying to do here is move the camera at the same rate as the subject. So for the one on the left, they'd be moving the camera to follow that chicken. And because they're moving the camera, you can see the background is blurred. It gives you a real impression of speed. Same with the race car on the right. The tip is, if you're photographing a race car or a chicken, what you want to do is start following the motion if you can before you take the picture. Press the shutter button and keep it moving. The DSLR viewfinder will black out while the shutter's open, so it's difficult to follow the motion. This is tricky and requires a lot of coordination. So if you're aiming for a pan shot, I recommend that you take lots of pictures, because chances are the first one or two aren't going to work out that well. Subject motion of the camera on tripod. The longer the shutter stays open, so you can see the difference between the left and the right pictures is how long the shutter stays open. At a slower shutter speed, the car tail lights are longer tracks of light. Very long exposures. Most of the phone cameras that I've seen will only keep the shutter open for 1 second or so. If you have a DSLR, you can keep the shutter button open as long as the shutter will stay open as long as the button is held down, or you can use a remote control. And these are just a couple of examples. The fireworks, the camera was on a tripod and the shutter locked open for 5 seconds. And for this one, the camera's on a tripod and the shutter locked open for several minutes. This is the Northern Lights. If you're doing action photos, you'll also find that your DSLR will let you shoot a single shot or continuous shots. So a single shot, and this is a setting under will be under your camera menus. Single shot, you have to press the shutter button for each shot. Continuous, what will happen is that the camera will keep shooting as long as the shutter button is pressed. Now, this is it will vary from camera to camera, and it will also vary depending on how fast your memory card is. But if you're trying to shoot something like these shots of the guy on the scooter, having a number of shots to choose from is a good thing. Also, for shooting portraits, as people's facial expressions change, sometimes you can find that, if you take 10 pictures in a burst, you might find that you've got 2 or 3 that were really effective as people's facial expressions change.